On New Year's Day morning, 1963, two bodies were discovered on the banks of Sydney's Lane Cove River, both partially clothed, positioned strangely, with no visible injuries and no clear cause of death. 62 years later, despite extensive investigations, autopsy findings, and countless theories, no one knows what killed Dr. Gilbert Bogle and Margaret Chandler. Sydney in the early 1960s was a city transforming itself. The harbor gleamed with promise. New suburbs sprawled outward. The scientific community was small, tight-knit, the kind of place where research physicists and their families socialized together regularly. Lane Cove, on Sydney's North Shore, was an established suburb where professionals lived in comfortable homes with water views and proximity to the city. December 31st, 1962, was hot, as Sydney summers always are. The kind of heat that makes evening parties appealing, when the temperature drops and people gather on verandas with drinks and conversation. It should have been just another New Year's Eve celebration among colleagues and friends. Instead, it became the beginning of one of Australia's most enduring mysteries. Dr. Gilbert Stanley Bogle was 38 years old, a brilliant physicist working at the Commonwealth Scientific and Industrial Research Organization, known as CSIRO. He specialized in chemical physics, the kind of work that required both theoretical understanding and practical application. Colleagues described him as intellectually intense, socially engaging, someone who could explain complex concepts with clarity. He was married to Vivian, and they had 4 children. By all external measures, he had built a successful life. Margaret Olive Chandler was 29, married to Jeffrey Chandler, a fellow scientist who also worked at CSIRO. Margaret herself worked as a scientific officer, intelligent and capable in her own right. Those who knew her described her as attractive, vivacious, someone who lit up social gatherings Gilbert and Margaret had been having an affair for several months. In the conservative Australia of 1962, this was conducted with discretion. Though people within their social circle were aware, it was the kind of situation that created quiet tension at gatherings, the sort of thing people noticed but didn't openly discuss. On New Year's Eve, Dr. Kenneth Nash and his wife hosted a party at their home on Billiard Avenue in Lane Cove. It was the usual crowd, scientists from CSIRO and their partners, people who'd socialized together many times before. The party began around 8 p.m. Gilbert arrived alone. Vivian was at home with their children. Jeffrey Chandler was away for work. Margaret came to the party solo. The evening progressed as these parties do: drinks, food, conversation. People moved between the house and the back veranda. The weather was warm but pleasant once the sun set. Witnesses would later struggle to reconstruct exact timings or who said what to whom, the challenge of remembering details from what seemed like an ordinary evening until it became extraordinary in retrospect. What investigators would later piece together was this. Gilbert and Margaret left the party together sometime between 11:30 p.m. and midnight. They told no one they were leaving. They simply disappeared from the gathering. Where they went immediately after leaving is unknown, but at some point they made their way to the banks of the Lane Cove River, less than half a kilometer from the Nash home. The riverbank at that location was accessible by a rough track, not somewhere you'd stumble upon accidentally. It was deliberate destination. Sometime in the early morning hours of January 1st, both Gilbert and Margaret died. Their bodies were discovered around 6:15 a.m. by a man walking in the area. The scene was deeply strange. Gilbert's body was found lying on his back on a piece of cardboard that had been placed on the ground. He was partially clothed, jacket and tie still on, but his trousers and underwear removed and placed neatly beside him. Margaret's body was nearby, also partially clothed, her dress pulled up. Both bodies were positioned in ways that suggested they'd been moving or adjusting their clothing when death occurred, but there was no blood. No visible injuries, no signs of violence, no indication of what had killed them. The police who responded to the scene found themselves looking at two dead people with no apparent cause of death, no weapon, no clear evidence of foul play, and no obvious explanation for why they died in this location at this time. Detective Sergeant Fred Creaghy of the New South Wales Police took charge of what would become one of the most frustrating investigations of his career. The first challenge was determining cause of death. The bodies were taken to Sydney's Department of Forensic Medicine for autopsy. The examinations were conducted by Dr. John Angus Bowes, the government medical officer, with multiple consultations as the results became increasingly perplexing. The autopsies revealed that both Gilbert and Margaret had died around the same time, likely between 1 and 3 a.m. Both had alcohol in their systems, but not excessive amounts, consistent with having attended a party, but not suggesting intoxication as a cause of death. And then things got complicated. Gilbert's autopsy showed severe congestion in his organs, suggesting something had interfered with his body's oxygen supply. But there was no evidence of suffocation, strangulation, or any other mechanical asphyxiation. His heart showed no signs of disease. There were no toxins found in the initial tests. Margaret's autopsy revealed similar organ congestion, again without clear cause. Both had died quickly, possibly within minutes of whatever affected them beginning. The toxicology tests available in 1963 were limited compared to modern standards. Investigators tested for common poisons: arsenic, strychnine, cyanide, barbiturates. Everything came back negative. They tested for carbon monoxide. Nothing. Whatever killed Gilbert and Margaret wasn't showing up in the available tests. Detective Creaghy began interviewing everyone who'd been at the party. The picture that emerged was of a typical social gathering until the couple's unexplained departure. No one reported seeing them leave. No one had noticed anything unusual about their behavior that evening. No one had any idea why they'd gone to the riverbank. The investigation took an unexpected turn when police received information about the affair between Gilbert and Margaret. This opened up new possibilities: jealous spouse, crime of passion. Someone who'd followed them, Jeffrey Chandler, Margaret's husband, had been away during New Year's Eve. His alibi solid. Vivian Bogle, Gilbert's wife, had been home with their children. But investigators began looking at whether anyone else might have harbored resentment about the relationship. The riverbank location was examined thoroughly. The cardboard Gilbert had been lying on was traced back to a nearby factory. It suggested some degree of planning, or at least that the location had been prepared, though it wasn't clear by whom. The positioning of the bodies and their clothing suggested intimacy interrupted. But by what? Theories began proliferating. Some investigators leaned toward poisoning, despite the negative toxicology results. Perhaps a poison that degraded quickly, or that they didn't have tests for. Others suggested the possibility of murder-suicide, though there was no evidence either person had brought anything to the scene that could have killed them both. The lack of violence made homicide seem unlikely, unless it involved a sophisticated poison. One line of investigation focused on hydrogen sulfide gas. Lane Cove River, like many urban waterways, had sewage issues in the 1960s. Could gas from decomposing organic matter in the river have somehow collected in a pocket near where the bodies were found, poisoning both people simultaneously? Gas experts were consulted. The theory was plausible but had problems. Hydrogen sulfide has a distinctive smell. It would have required specific weather conditions to concentrate, and it would likely have left more obvious signs. The inquest began in March 1963, with coroner J.J. Looms presiding. Witness after witness testified about the party, the victims, the discovery of the bodies. Medical experts debated causes of death. The inquest ran for months, compiling thousands of pages of testimony and reports. As the inquest progressed through 1963 and into 1964, the case captured public imagination across Australia. The mysterious circumstances, the affair angle, the complete lack of clear answers. It became the kind of case people discussed and theorized about. The medical evidence remained frustratingly inconclusive. Dr. Bose and his colleagues conducted extensive analysis, but the cause of death defied determination. The organs showed congestion consistent with acute circulatory failure, but what caused that failure remained unknown. Some medical experts suggested the possibility of a rare allergic reaction or acute cardiovascular event affecting both people simultaneously, though the statistical probability of that seemed vanishingly small. The most sensational theory emerged involving LSD. In the early 1960s, LSD was a relatively new substance, and understanding of its effects was limited. Some theorized that Gilbert and Margaret might have taken LSD, either knowingly or unknowingly, and that it had killed them. However, there were significant problems with this theory. LSD was not known to cause death in the manner observed. The symptoms didn't match, and there was no evidence either person had any connection to LSD or any reason they would have taken it. A more disturbing theory involved deliberate poisoning by a third party. This required someone with access to an exotic poison undetectable by 1963 forensic methods, someone who knew where Gilbert and Margaret would be, and someone who could administer the poison without being detected. Investigators looked at various suspects within the social circle. Was there someone at the party with chemistry knowledge who could have slipped something into their drinks? Were they followed to the riverbank by someone who poisoned them there? The challenge with the poisoning theory was the lack of any solid evidence pointing to a specific person. Jeffrey Chandler was investigated thoroughly, but his alibi held firm. No one else emerged as a credible suspect with both motive and opportunity. The forensic limitations of 1963 meant that if an exotic or unusual poison had been used, they might not detect it even if they suspected poisoning. Another avenue of investigation looked at Gilbert's work. As a physicist working on classified research, could his death have been connected to espionage or intelligence concerns? This was the Cold War, and Australia had its share of security concerns. But investigators found nothing suggesting Gilbert had been involved in anything that would make him a target. And even if that explained his death, it didn't explain Margaret's simultaneous death from the same unknown cause. In May 1964, after 15 months of investigation and testimony, Coroner Looms delivered his findings. He determined that both Gilbert Bogle and Margaret Chandler had died from acute circulatory failure brought about by some agent, but the nature of that agent could not be determined from the evidence available. The inquest ended with the cause of death officially listed as unknown. The conclusion satisfied no one. Families wanted answers. The public wanted resolution. Investigators felt frustrated by their inability to solve what should have been a determinable cause of death. And the theories continued to circulate, each with adherents convinced they knew what had really happened. In subsequent decades, the Bogle-Chandler case has been revisited multiple times with advancing forensic technology. In the 1990s, tissue samples that had been preserved were retested with more sophisticated toxicology methods. Again, nothing definitive emerged. In 2006, a documentary re-examined the case, with experts proposing the hydrogen sulfide theory as most likely, though still unproven. The case remains officially unsolved, one of Australia's most famous mysteries. The families of both Gilbert and Margaret lived with unanswered questions, the kind of unresolved grief that compounds tragedy with confusion. The Bogle-Chandler case represents forensic science's limitations in a specific era. If this happened today, we'd have toxicology tests that could detect hundreds of compounds that were invisible to 1963 technology. We'd have DNA analysis, environmental testing, digital trails that might reveal where they'd gone and who they'd contacted. But in 1963, investigators had to work with what they had, and what they had wasn't enough. The case also reminds us how uncomfortable we are with unsolved mysteries. We want explanations. We want causes. We want someone to blame or something to point to and say, "That's what happened." The idea that two people could die mysteriously, and we might never know why, challenges our sense of order. So here's my question. Given what you've heard, which theory makes the most sense to you? The hydrogen sulfide gas from the river? An undetectable poison? Something we haven't even considered? I'm genuinely curious what stands out to people hearing this case fresh. Drop your thoughts in the comments. This is the final episode of the Deadly New Beginnings series. If you've been following along, thank you. If you want more international mysteries where the investigation is as compelling as the story, subscribe. New episodes drop 3 times a week. This has been Umbra Cases.